Thanks for joining us for another episode of ALPS in Brief. My name is Chris Newbold. I'm Executive Vice President of ALPS. And today I'm sitting in downtown Seattle in the offices of the Washington State Bar Association with a colleague and a friend, Paul Littlewood, who's the Executive Director of the Washington State Bar Association. And I want to talk about a subject that is kind of trending nationally, which is thinking about how we battle access to justice issues, and one of the innovative programs that the Washington State Bar is involved with, which is the LLLT program, the Limited Legal License Technician. And before we start, Paula, if you could introduce yourself, your role, and what the Washington State Bar does.
Hi, I'm Paula Littlewood, Executive Director of the Washington State Bar Association. I've been here about 15 years. The Washington State Bar is what's known as an integrated bar, so we are the regulatory agency operating under delegated authority from the Washington Supreme Court to regulate all licensed legal professionals in the state of Washington. And we are also the professional association supporting our members as they do their work and serve the public.
Okay. And one of the issues that we're kind of really focusing on today is the issue of access to justice. We know that 80 to 90% of folks with civil legal problems in the United States, particularly those of low income, never receive help from a lawyer. And I know that one of the things that you've been trying to do as part of your job here in Washington is to think about that challenge and to come up with solutions. One of the ways that you've done that is a program that if you go out to the National Bar Association regional bar gatherings, it's hard not to hear about this particular subject that you all are at the forefront of. So talk about what the LLLT program is and why it's unique and why it's just kind of different when you think about the context of alternative legal services.
Mm-hmm. Probably the first thing I'd say is it's not a program, it's a license. And so what we are doing in Washington State is licensing the first independent paraprofessional in the legal profession in the United States. So in many states, you might be familiar with a nurse practitioner in the medical field. Nurse practitioners in many states, in our state, are licensed to work independently of a doctor to give medical advice up to a certain point, and then when they reach the edge of their license and the scope of their responsibility that they're licensed to do, they refer the patient on to the doctor. LLLT is the exact same concept in the legal field. So a LLLT is licensed. They have a limited license, hence the name, limited license, legal technician, to work independently if they choose, open their own practice separate from a lawyer, to provide legal advice in certain practice areas. So the Supreme Court rule that creates this license is designed to be applied in various practice areas. The first practice area that the LLLTs are licensed in Washington State is family law. One of the things that the Supreme Court's LLLT board is exploring now is what the next practice area will be, because it's envisioned that some LLLTs may want to get licensed in multiple areas, or there may be people that aren't interested in family law, but if a different practice area comes online, then they may choose to become a LLLT in that practice area. I think it's important to distinguish the LLLT from other alternative service providers that we all are familiar with nationwide. We have document preparers, we have courthouse facilitators, we have the New York navigators, who are all critical in helping, serve the public. But the difference with the LLLT is they are licensed to give legal advice, just like Chris and I are as lawyers. Mm-hmm. So we actually don't consider LLLTs non-lawyers, because they have a license to practice law from the state Supreme Court, just like I do. It's just that they have a limited license and can only provide services up to a certain amount, and then by court rule are required to refer the client on to a lawyer.
Okay, and what was the catalyst for the program? Who provided kind of the thought leadership in coming up with the concept?
So it's sort of a two-track approach that it came in on. There was a Supreme Court board. The Washington Supreme Court had a board known as the Practice Law Board, and they were looking at unauthorized practice of law and how can we deal with the unauthorized practice of law. So that was sort of one track that brought us the LLT, because they were trying to figure out how do you provide to the consumer qualified and regulated legal service providers. At the same time, our Washington Supreme Court had commissioned a civil legal needs study which quantified the unmet need, and Chris referenced this at the beginning of our talk, the unmet need in our country. The civil legal needs study, we knew we had a lot of unmet need, but it gave us an actual quantification that 80 to 85% of low and moderate income folks were going without the representation that they needed in critical civil matters. So between those two things, the need to get more qualified and regulated providers into the marketplace and the staggering unmet need, the Practice Law Board worked for about 8 years and recommended to the Washington Supreme Court the creation of this license, the limited license legal technician license, and the court adopted the rule in 2012, and we were off to the races.
Okay, and when was the first class of those applying for licensure?
It was about 2 years later. So remember, so when the court created the license, they also created the limited license legal technician board, because the Supreme Court needed a board that would figure out sort of how the how the license would run. Mm-hmm. And as the court's regulatory agency, we staff and fund that board. So we work together because we're the regulator and they're the Supreme Court's board setting all the policy. So it took 2 years to, I mean, if you think about what the LLT board was doing, they were creating a new profession out of whole cloth. Mm-hmm. And when you hear the chair of the LLT board talk about it, he'll say it wasn't like we could go to California or New York and pull their rule off the shelf and say, okay, let's modify it to fit in Washington. So they had to define the scope of family law and what these folks would be allowed to do. We had to design a curriculum to train them. We had to design a bar exam. So, we were creating a whole profession. So it took about 2 years until we actually had candidates in the process being trained. Mm-hmm. So we're about 2012, 2018. We're, 6 years in? And right now we have 27 who are licensed. We have another 60 or so that are completing education and admission requirements. And then we probably have a couple hundred coming up through the community colleges. The education happens at 2 levels. There's what we call a core education at the community college level, and once they complete that, then they can move on to the practice area education, which is offered through the University of Washington Law School. Mm-hmm. So we've had people say to us, "That's all you have," and we're saying, "Well, we were starting from ground zero." So yeah. I think once it starts picking up momentum,
Well, one of the things that we found very interesting about the class of folks that you are licensing is just, you required them to have malpractice insurance, mm-hmm. and ALPS, as the endorsed carrier of the Washington State Bar, actually found it to be a very appealing risk group because of the extensiveness of the educational requirements that you place upon these folks who mm-hmm. aren't going to law school, but I would venture to say are actually more qualified and trained coming out of their program than most folks coming out of law school. So I wanted you to just kind of comment on just the extensiveness of the training that mm-hmm. your LLTs have to engage in to earn this distinction.
And one of the University of Washington law professors said the exact same thing when we came to the end of developing the family law practice area curriculum. He said, these folks are going to be better trained in family law than our JDs coming out. Which, I went to law school and never took family law, and I could have started practicing family law the day I received my license. Mm-hmm. So the family law training is 15 credits. So 5 credits are just basic family law, probably what a lot of us, if I had, would have taken in law school. And then the next 10 credits drill down very deeply into the actual scope. One of the most important things, and this is where I and Chief Regulatory Counsel and Chief Disciplinary Counsel were probably most involved, was in this training aspect, because we wanted to make sure these folks understood the scope of their authority. and most importantly, when they'd come to the edge of it and gone beyond it. So actually, when we first took the curriculum to the LLLT board, the LLLT board said, wait a minute, you're training them to do things they can't do. And we said, yeah, we have to expose them to things that they can't do so they understand when they've crossed the line. And each class is twin taught by a law professor and a practitioner, which when I think back to my own law school experience, if somebody would have been giving me the doctrine and at the same time then saying, and here's what it's going to look like on the ground, would have been really helpful. Gonzaga is also helping teach the classes, so, and I would be remiss to not thank ALPS for stepping in. As Chris mentioned, we do require malpractice insurance for the LLLTs. We do not yet in Washington require that for lawyers. But we had talked to a couple of insurance carriers and they said exactly what Chris said. These guys are less risk, better trained, narrower scope, right? Whereas lawyers can sort of
go everywhere.
So, so we thank ALPS hugely for stepping in and believing in the license and believing in the caliber of the providers we're turning out.
So what would you, as you think about the future, what do you think is the outlook for the program and for the
license?
For the license, because I do think it's one of those that's very unique nationally. Is a lot of people are kind of keeping their eyes on it. Talk about just what your outlook is for the license here in Washington and what you see kind of down the road in terms of the many speaking engagements you've done nationally in terms of thinking about where other states may go on this issue.
Well, there's a number of states that are looking at it. Utah's probably the closest. Their rule is drafted. I think they're working on development of their exam. I think they're calling them limited license practice. I can't remember. A little bit different name. Oregon has had 2 task forces recommend that they do it, so we'll just wait and see if when they get to putting rubber to the road. New Mexico was looking at it. California jumped in the water right behind us. They were moving pretty quickly, but I think they've got other issues they're dealing with right now. Minnesota was looking at it. Florida, trying to think, Montana looked at it. And I'll tell you where we've been traveling a lot is Canada. We've probably been to 4 or 5 provinces now. They're quite interested in it, a number of their provinces. And I think in particular areas, states where there's a lot of a rural population, because we all know it's getting more and more difficult to recruit lawyers into the rural areas. And so I think there's a lot of states in some of these provinces that are seeing that the LLLT might be an option to serve rural areas, because the nice thing for the LLLT is since they go to a community college for the first part of their education, they get to stay in their community, right? And then the practice area education that's offered by the law school is streamed, so you can actually be anywhere to take the law school classes. They're synchronous, so it's not like they're downloading an iPod or a podcast at 3 in the morning. We've taught in the classes, it's very interactive. The students are there, they're chatting at you. And so I think a lot of states and definitely these provinces are looking at a possible solution for serving rural populations.
Is there anything that's surprised you about the license, or as it's now kind of moved from concept to regulatory infrastructure to an actual class of folks that you're regulating?
There were a couple of things. One was the collaborations that developed. One was our 3 law schools saying, don't have us each develop a curriculum, we'll do it together. And so that was really fun. We worked with the 3 law schools in the state to develop the family law curriculum, and then the collaboration between the community colleges and the law schools. So there were sort of these collaborations that we never anticipated that were really fun, because everybody sort of came together and said, how are we going to make this the best license possible? And it sort of created a culture of innovation in Washington. Once there was, as the bar and a lot of people were very opposed to this right up until the bitter end. And once the Supreme Court spoke, once the Supreme Court passed the rule and said this is the direction we're going, we need to do this for the public, it really, in a lot of ways, created a culture of innovation. We had people coming to us saying, have you thought about the LLLT in this area or that area? We had the Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys came and said, there's some parenting things where we think LLTs might be helpful. The ALJs have approached us, and so that was kind of exciting. Not to say we don't still have, people that question the idea or are suspicious. County bars have started embracing them. They're members of the county bars. The Washington State Bar 2 years ago, the Board of Governors voted to make LLTs members of the bar. So, that's all been super exciting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. You and I, we were observers of legal trends, right? And our profession is not the fastest to adapt to emerging challenges that society, thrust upon us. I thought it was interesting going back to the Supreme Court order that started the license. Here's the quote: "We have a duty to ensure the public can access affordable, legal, and law-related services, and that they are not left to fall prey to the perils of the unregulated marketplace." Right, and it just seems like that's the type of your Supreme Court frankly went on a limb a little bit and said, you know what, we think that there's something to be said for creating this opportunity, and it's kind of interesting to now watch what the 6 years later where you're at now and where you hope to go.
Yeah, well, as we tell every place where we speak about it, come on in, the water's fine.
Well, good. Thank you, Paula. I appreciate your time. It's a fascinating subject, and as we think about access to justice and alternative legal services, it's clearly an issue that observers are going to be watching from around the country.
Great.
Thank
you.